Imagine losing everything, your throne, your home, even your identity, in a single, crushing blow. One day, you're a king, draped in finery and surrounded by loyal subjects. The next, you're an outcast, hunted and humiliated, with nothing but your wits to keep you alive. This wasn't just a nightmare for medieval rulers. It was reality. And yet, against all odds, some of these exiled kings did the unthinkable. They clawed their way back to power, turning defeat into victory through sheer cunning and unshakable determination. Their stories aren't just dusty tales from the past. They're masterclasses in strategy, resilience, and the art of the comeback. Think about the sheer audacity it took to reclaim a lost kingdom. Picture a ruler stripped of his crown, wandering foreign courts with nothing but his name and a burning desire for justice. How did he convince armies to follow him? How did he outmaneuver enemies who'd already written him off? The answers lie in the secret playbook of exiled kings, a mix of diplomacy, deception, and daring that would put modern strategists to shame. These weren't just lucky breaks, they were carefully calculated moves honed over years of exile, each one a testament to the unyielding human spirit. What makes their stories so compelling isn't just the drama, it's the timeless lessons they offer. Whether it's forging alliances in the shadows, turning rivals against each other, or using propaganda to win hearts and minds, these kings understood the delicate dance of power long before it became a textbook concept. And here's the thing, their tactics weren't just about brute force. They were about psychology, patience, and knowing when to strike. So if you've ever felt like the odds were stacked against you, stay with us. Because by the end of this journey, you'll see how even the most hopeless situations can be flipped, one brilliant move at a time. In the fractured world of medieval politics, exile wasn't just a punishment, it was a death sentence for your reign unless you could turn desperation into opportunity. Kings who lost their thrones didn't just vanish into obscurity, they became master players in a high-stakes game of survival, where one wrong move could mean execution or lifelong imprisonment. And their greatest weapon, alliances with foreign powers. Picture this, a deposed king stripped of his army and treasury, arriving at the court of a rival ruler with nothing but his title and a promise. It sounds like suicide, yet some of history's most stunning comebacks began exactly this way. Take the story of Henry IV of England. When he was forced into exile after a rebellion, he didn't wallow in self-pity, he went straight to France. The French king, seeing a chance to weaken England, gave him troops, gold, and legitimacy. Within months, Henry returned at the head of an invading force, toppling his enemies and reclaiming his crown. But here's the catch, foreign allies weren't charity cases. They demanded steep prices, land, political favors, even future loyalty in wars. A restored king often became a puppet, dancing to the tune of the very ruler who saved him. And then there's the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, nicknamed the Slit-Nosed after his mutilation and exile. Most men would have given up, but Justinian spent years courting the Khazars, a nomadic empire north of the Black Sea. He married a Khazar princess, secured an army, and stormed back to Constantinople, retaking his throne in a bloody coup. His story reveals a brutal truth. Exile wasn't just about finding allies, it was about choosing the right ones, even if they seemed unlikely. The Khazars weren't traditional power players, but their cavalry was unmatched, and their hunger for Byzantine gold made them perfect partners. But forging these alliances required more than just charisma. Exiled kings had to become diplomats, spinning their misfortune into a compelling narrative. They portrayed themselves as wronged monarchs, their thrones stolen by usurpers who threatened the stability of the realm. To foreign rulers, they weren't beggars, they were investments. Backing a deposed king was like buying a lottery ticket. If he won, you gained influence, land, or a grateful ally on a rival throne. And if he lost, well, at least you'd weakened a neighboring kingdom in the process. The genius of these exiled rulers lay in their ability to turn vulnerability into leverage. With no army or treasury, they offered something even more valuable: legitimacy. A foreign power backing a true king could claim moral superiority, painting their intervention as righteous rather than opportunistic. It was propaganda wrapped in diplomacy, and it worked shockingly often. So the next time you hear about a medieval king's triumphant return, remember, behind every comeback was a web of alliances, each thread carefully woven in the shadows of exile. But securing foreign allies was only half the battle. What came next was a masterclass in perception management. Exiled kings realized early that brute force alone wouldn't win back their thrones. They needed to control the narrative. Enter propaganda, the medieval version of a PR campaign. While modern leaders have social media and press conferences, these rulers had bards, scribes, and whispers in the marketplace. Their goal: to paint themselves as the rightful heirs, chosen by divine will, while branding their rivals as tyrants or usurpers. Take Henry Tudor's rise to power. While hiding in Brittany, he didn't just gather troops, he circulated stories. Tales of Richard III's alleged crimes, from murdering his nephews to seizing the crown through treachery, spread like wildfire. Whether true or exaggerated, these rumors eroded public trust in Richard's rule, making Henry's eventual invasion look less like a power grab and more like a liberation. And it worked. By the time Henry landed on English soil, many saw him not as an exiled fugitive, but as a savior. The Byzantine Empire took it even further. Emperors like Justinian II commissioned lavish mosaics and coins depicting their triumphant returns, often with religious imagery suggesting God's favor. One surviving coin shows Justinian with Christ himself placing the crown back on his head, a blatant message that his restoration wasn't just political, it was destiny. This wasn't subtle, but subtlety didn't win thrones. Yet propaganda wasn't just about flashy symbols. It hinged on understanding the fears and hopes of ordinary people. A king returning from exile might promise lower taxes, end to corruption, or protection from invaders, whatever resonated most. In Scotland, Robert the Bruce spent years in hiding after defeats, but his supporters kept alive stories of his bravery and commitment to Scottish independence. By the time he re-emerged, he wasn't just a rebel, he was a symbol of national resistance. The brilliance of these campaigns lay in their flexibility. If a king lacked military strength, he could still win through persuasion. If his rival had more soldiers, he could undermine their loyalty. And if all else failed, he could reframe exile itself as a test of virtue, proof that his suffering had purified him for greater leadership. It was psychological warfare centuries before the term existed, turning whispers into weapons and doubt into defeat. So while foreign alliances provided the muscle, propaganda provided the soul. Together, they transformed exiled kings from forgotten losers into inevitable victors. And in a world where perception shaped reality, that was often enough to tip the scales. Mercenaries, the hired swords of the medieval world, became the lifeline for exiled kings with empty treasuries but desperate ambitions. When a deposed ruler couldn't rely on loyal vassals or foreign allies alone, these professional fighters offered a brutal shortcut back to power. Unlike feudal levies bound by oaths and local ties, mercenaries fought for gold, not glory, and for a king in exile that was perfect. No need to win their hearts, just fill their pockets. Consider the case of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. After a crushing defeat left him exiled and humiliated, he didn't waste time begging for noble support. Instead, he hired Swiss pikemen, the most feared infantry of their day, and Italian condottieri, cunning commanders who sold their skills to the highest bidder. With this patchwork army, he nearly clawed his way back to dominance. The lesson: mercenaries didn't care about royal bloodlines or divine right. They cared about payday. And for a cash-strapped exile, that meant creative financing. Some kings pledged future taxes, others signed away mining rights or trade monopolies. One desperate ruler even promised mercenaries a cut of his kingdom's loot before he'd reconquered it. But mercenaries were a double-edged sword. While they provided instant muscle, their loyalty evaporated the moment the money dried up. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios IV learned this the hard way. To reclaim his throne, he contracted a small fortune's worth of Venetian and Crusader mercenaries. But when he couldn't pay, they turned on him, sacking Constantinople instead of saving it. This was the gamble exiled kings faced. Mercenaries could win a throne, but they could also burn it down. Yet the smartest rulers didn't just hire mercenaries, they weaponized their reputations. The mere presence of, say, German Landsknechts or Catalan crossbowmen could terrify rivals into surrender. Their brutality wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. A usurper might withstand a rebellion, but facing an army of battle-hardened strangers, that shook confidence. And in the chaos of exile, perception often decided the fight before the first arrow flew. What's fascinating is how these kings turned a transactional relationship into a strategic advantage. Without the baggage of feudal loyalty, mercenaries followed orders without question, no debates about honor or tradition. If an exiled king needed a midnight raid, a ruthless ambush, or a siege pushed beyond the rules of war, mercenaries obliged. In the cutthroat game of throne reclaiming, that flexibility was priceless. So while poets sang of noble knights and chivalry, the realists knew sometimes the fastest way home was bought, not earned. Gold couldn't win wars alone. It took a network of financiers willing to bet on a king's comeback. While mercenaries provided the muscle, exiled rulers needed patrons to foot the bill, turning their quest into a high-stakes investment opportunity. Enter the bankers, merchants, and rival nobles who saw potential profit in a deposed monarch's desperation. For them, backing an exile wasn't charity. It was a calculated gamble with the chance of massive returns. Take King Sigismund of Hungary. After losing his throne, he didn't just scrape together coins from his own pockets, he courted the wealthiest families in Europe. The Luxembourg bankers, eager to expand their influence, funded his mercenary armies in exchange for future trade privileges and a slice of Hungarian silver mines. It was a win-win. Sigismund got his fighting force and his backers secured a king in their debt. But this wasn't just about money changing hands. These deals came with invisible strings, tying the restored ruler to his creditors for years. Miss a payment, and those loyal mercenaries might suddenly switch sides. The Italian city-states perfected this game. Florentine financiers like the Medici bankrolled exiled princes across the Mediterranean, treating thrones like commodities. They knew a successful restoration meant repaid loans with interest plus political favors. One ledger from the 15th century shows a Tuscan banker quietly funding 3 rival claimants to the same throne, hedging his bets like a medieval venture capitalist. No matter who won, he profited, yet securing funding required more than just a persuasive pitch. Exiled kings had to prove they were viable investments. They'd offer collateral crown jewels, future tax revenues, even their children's marriage alliances. Some signed contracts pledging entire provinces to their backers upon victory. The risk, if they failed, their financiers lost everything. But when it worked, the rewards were staggering. After the Norwegian King Olaf II was exiled, Danish nobles bankrolled his return, knowing control of Norway's trade routes would repay them tenfold. The smartest rulers turned their exile into a sales pitch. They'd highlight their rivals' weaknesses: high taxes, unstable rule, or unpopular wars, to convince backers that their return would stabilize the region. It wasn't just about reclaiming a throne, it was about selling a vision of prosperity. And in an era where money moved faster than armies, that vision could be the difference between a forgotten exile and a triumphant king. Money talked louder than swords when it came to staging a royal comeback. For exiled kings, every mercenary, every ship, every suit of armor required gold, mountains of it. And since their treasuries were usually seized the moment they fled, they had to get creative. Some pawned family heirlooms, like the crown jewels of Navarre, melted down to pay for soldiers. Others signed away future rights, mining privileges, port taxes, even their daughters' hands in marriage, to the highest bidder. But the smartest rulers didn't just beg for coins. They turned their exile into a pitch, convincing wealthy backers that funding their return was the ultimate investment. Edward IV of England mastered this game. After losing his throne to the Lancastrians in 1470, he didn't sulk, he hustled. Crossing the Channel to Burgundy, he charmed Duke Charles the Bold into opening his coffers. The deal: Burgundian bankers funded Edward's invasion, and in return they got preferential wool trade rights and a friendly English king on the throne. It was a cold calculation. Charles wasn't helping out of kindness. He knew a pro-Burgundy England would strangle his French rivals, and Edward, desperate to reclaim power, played along brilliantly. Within months, that borrowed gold turned into ships, then soldiers, then a victorious march into London. But not every ruler had Edward's charm. Some resorted to outright deception. The deposed King James III of Scotland once mortgaged the same stretch of coastline to 3 different foreign merchants, promising exclusive tariffs to each. When he regained power, those creditors came knocking only to find their exclusive rights overlapped. The resulting lawsuits dragged on for years, proving that while exiled kings needed money, burning bridges with financiers could backfire spectacularly. The real geniuses, though, exploited their enemy's greatest weakness: greed. When Henry VII plotted his return from Brittany, he didn't just focus on raising funds. He targeted the financial instability of Richard III's regime. Rumors spread that Richard had emptied England's treasury, alienating tax-weary nobles. Henry's backers, smelling blood in the water, poured money into his campaign, betting that a cash-strapped opponent was ripe for collapse. And they were right. The Battle of Bosworth wasn't just won by swords. It was won by shrewd financial warfare, where the side with the deeper pockets and the smarter spending emerged victorious. This was the unglamorous truth behind royal restorations. Behind every triumphant return lay ledgers of debt, backroom deals, and the cold reality that thrones weren't reclaimed through bravery alone. They were bought, and for the bankers who funded these gambles, the rewards could be staggering or ruinous, because in the high-stakes game of king-making, the only thing riskier than backing an exile was betting against one. Yet even the best-funded campaigns could falter if the enemy stood united, which is why the savviest exiled kings didn't just raise money, they sowed discord, turning their rivals' courts into battlegrounds of mistrust and betrayal. Because nothing weakened a usurper's grip on power faster than his own allies questioning his rule. A kingdom divided was a kingdom ripe for the taking, and exiled kings became masters at turning their enemies' unity into chaos. While mercenaries and gold bought armies, nothing weakened a usurper's grip faster than his own allies questioning his rule. The smartest deposed rulers didn't just plan invasions, they orchestrated betrayals from within, peeling away support one whispered promise at a time. Spies slipped into court carrying messages of rebellion. Disgruntled nobles received secret offers, lands restored, titles elevated, grievances addressed if only they'd switch sides at the right moment. This wasn't just warfare, it was psychological sabotage where the most dangerous weapons weren't swords but doubt and ambition. Robert the Bruce's campaign to reclaim Scotland shows this tactic at its finest. While hiding in the Highlands, he didn't just rally clans, he systematically undermined the English-backed Scottish lords. One by one, he turned them, playing on their resentment of foreign rule. To a noble taxed into poverty by Edward I, he offered relief. To another humiliated by English overlords, he promised vengeance. By the time Robert emerged from exile, half his enemies were already his allies, their loyalty bought not with gold, but with the chance to reclaim their dignity. The English found themselves fighting not just Bruce's army, but a rebellion they never saw coming because it had been brewing in their own ranks. The Byzantine Empire's exiled emperors took it further. When Isaac the Angelos was overthrown, his brother Alexios didn't rush to attack. Instead, he spent months bribing Constantinople's bureaucrats, the very administrators who kept the city running. Tax collectors, dock officials, even the palace guards, all received discreet pledges of rewards if they'd look the other way when the time came. When Alexios finally struck, the capital didn't resist. It collapsed from within, its machinery of power greased by his whispers. Yet exploiting divisions required more than just opportunism. It demanded an intimate understanding of the rival court's fissures, who felt overlooked, who hungered for more power, who nursed old grudges. Exiled kings became students of their enemies' weaknesses, collecting grievances like chess pieces to be moved at the perfect moment, and timing was everything. Moved too soon and the plot unraveled, too late and the moment passed, the best restorations unfolded like carefully scripted dramas, where every betrayal happened on cue. This strategy carried brutal risks, of course. A bribe discovered, a spy caught, a promise broken. Any misstep could doom the plan, but for kings with nothing left to lose, the gamble was worth it. Because in the end, no fortress was impregnable, no alliance unbreakable, and as history proved again and again, even the mightiest throne could topple when its foundations were quietly eroded from within. Patience then became the exiled king's silent weapon. While their rivals grew complacent, these deposed rulers plotted in the shadows, content to let months or even years pass while their schemes took root. They understood something most conquerors forgot. A throne wasn't just won on the battlefield. It was stolen piece by piece in the quiet moments when no one was watching. Patience wasn't just a virtue for exiled kings, it was a weapon. While some rulers rushed back to reclaim their thrones in a blaze of glory, the savviest understood that time could be their greatest ally. Waiting wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Every passing year weakened their rivals, eroded alliances, and created new opportunities, and no one mastered this long game better than Charles II of England. After his father's execution and the collapse of the monarchy, he spent 9 years drifting across Europe, from France to the Dutch Republic, even living in poverty in Spain. To outsiders, it looked like defeat, but Charles wasn't idling, he was observing. He watched as England's experiment with republican rule unraveled under infighting and unrest. He listened as whispers grew louder for a return to tradition, and when the moment was ripe, he didn't charge in with an army. He simply stepped ashore to cheers, his throne handed back to him by a nation exhausted by chaos. This wasn't luck, it was cold, calculated timing. Acting too soon would have made Charles just another rebel, crushed by Cromwell's lingering loyalists. Waiting too long might have allowed a rival claimant to seize the narrative, but by letting the political winds shift in his favor, he turned exile from a punishment into a positioning move. The same pattern played out with Alfonso VI of Leon, who bided his time for 17 years while his brother's reign collapsed under mismanagement and rebellion. When Alfonso finally marched home, his weary subjects welcomed him as a solution, not a conqueror. The lesson here is counterintuitive. Sometimes losing the throne was the best way to keep it. Exile forced kings to shed the arrogance of power and see their kingdoms through fresh eyes. They learned which factions were fickle, which grudges festered, and which promises rang hollow. And when they returned, they didn't just reclaim a title, they rewrote the rules of the game. Because in the end, the throne wasn't won by the swiftest or the strongest. It went to those who knew when to wait, when to whisper, and when to let their enemies defeat themselves. Yet even the most patient rulers needed one final edge to tip the scales in their favor, a force more powerful than armies or gold. For in an age where heaven and earth were deeply entwined, no king could truly reclaim his throne without the blessing of the divine, and that's where religion entered the battlefield. In the medieval world, where heaven and earth were believed to touch, exiled kings didn't just reclaim thrones, they staged holy revivals. Religion wasn't merely a comfort for these deposed rulers, it was a weapon, sharpened in exile and wielded with precision upon their return. Consider Henry IV of France, a Protestant king ruling a Catholic majority nation. When Paris revolted against him, he didn't charge in with troops. Instead, he converted, famously declaring, "Paris is worth a mass." Overnight, his greatest obstacle became his greatest asset, transforming rebellion into reverence. This wasn't just pragmatism, it was political theater at its most divine. But Henry wasn't alone in turning faith into a lifeline. The exiled Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV secured papal backing by renouncing his predecessor's anti-church policies, trading political concessions for the Vatican's endorsement. With the Pope's blessing, Otto's return wasn't an invasion, it was a crusade. Meanwhile, in Iberia, Alfonso VI of Leon leveraged his reputation as a defender of Christianity against Moorish kingdoms, framing his exile as a test of faith and his return as God's will. Clerics preached sermons about his divine mission, turning peasants into fervent supporters overnight. The brilliance of these strategies lay in their dual power. Religious backing didn't just legitimize a king's claim, it demonized his rivals. A usurper could crush rebellions, but fighting heaven itself, that was a battle no army could win. When Baldwin IV of Jerusalem returned from exile, his camp circulated visions of saints endorsing him, while his opponents were labeled heretics in clandestine pamphlets. The result: desertions, defections, and a throne reclaimed without a major battle. Yet weaponizing faith required more than just symbolism. Exiled kings had to embed themselves in religious networks, monasteries that housed their spies, bishops who whispered in nobles' ears, pilgrim routes that doubled as supply lines. These weren't passive alliances, they were active collaborations where scripture and strategy blurred. And when a king finally marched home, it wasn't just soldiers at his back, it was the unshakable belief that his victory was ordained. Which brings us to another secret weapon in the exiled king's arsenal: marriage. While religion secured divine legitimacy, strategic unions locked down earthly power, turning distant courts into family and rivals into in-laws. Because in the end, even the holiest crusade needed cold, hard alliances, and nothing sealed a pact like blood. A royal wedding in the Middle Ages was never just a celebration, it was a chess move. For exiled kings, marriage became one of the most potent weapons in their arsenal, a way to turn romance into reinforcements overnight. Take Ferdinand of Aragon. whose union with Isabella of Castile didn't just unite two hearts, it fused two kingdoms, transforming him from a regional ruler into the architect of modern Spain. But this wasn't about grand gestures or love letters. It was cold, hard strategy. Isabella brought him armies, territories, and legitimacy, while he offered military genius and political cunning. Together, they didn't just reclaim thrones, they built an empire. Yet Ferdinand's story was just one variation on an ancient playbook. When the deposed King Eric of Sweden needed to break his isolation in the 14th century, he didn't raise an army, he proposed. His marriage to the sister of the Norwegian king instantly gave him access to ships, soldiers, and a safe base to launch his comeback. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire, the exiled Constantine VI secured his return by wedding the daughter of a powerful general, trading vows for loyalty. These weren't love matches, they were mergers, binding exiled kings to the resources they desperately needed. The real art lay in choosing the right partner. A marriage to a minor noble might secure a few hundred troops, but wedding the heir of a rival kingdom, that could flip the entire board. Consider Matilda of England, who spent years in exile after losing her throne to Stephen. Her masterstroke, marrying her son to Elena of Aquitaine, the most powerful woman in Europe. Overnight, Matilda's cause gained Aquitaine's vast wealth and influence, turning a fading claim into an unstoppable resurgence. But these alliances came with razor-sharp risks. A poorly chosen union could alienate more allies than it gained. When the exiled King John of Bohemia married a French princess, he hoped for Paris's backing, only to find himself dragged into France's wars, stretching his resources thin. And then there were the personal costs. Many of these political spouses lived separate lives, their marriages existing only on parchment. Love was irrelevant, loyalty was contractual. The shrewdest exiled kings, though, didn't just use marriage to secure power, they weaponized it against their enemies. By marrying into a rival's family, they could create factions within the opposing court, turning dinner tables into battlegrounds. A well-placed queen or prince consort could whisper dissent, sway opinions, or even orchestrate betrayals. In the shadows, these royal weddings were less about unity and more about infiltration. And that's where the final piece of the puzzle came into play, because even with armies, gold, and strategic marriages, exiled kings still needed to dismantle their rivals' support, not on the battlefield, but in the silent war of diplomacy. Because no throne was ever truly won alone. Diplomatic isolation wasn't about brute force, it was about surgically dismantling an opponent's support system, one alliance at a time. For exiled kings, the path back to power often hinged on making their rivals look like liabilities rather than leaders. Take Louis XI of France, a master of this shadowy art. While in exile, he didn't just gather allies, he actively poisoned his enemies' relationships, convincing Burgundy that England's growing influence threatened their independence. The result, Burgundy withdrew its troops, leaving England exposed. Louis didn't have to win a battle, he just let his rivals' own alliances crumble. But isolating an opponent required more than just whispers. It demanded an intimate understanding of international grudges, trade disputes, and royal egos. The exiled Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII knew this well. When plotting his return, he discovered that the Latin rulers holding Constantinople were deeply resented by Venice's merchants for stifling their trade. So Michael secretly promised the Venetians lower tariffs and prime docking rights if they'd withdraw support. The moment Venetian ships sailed away, the Latin Empire's grip on the city weakened overnight. The real genius of this strategy lay in its subtlety. Unlike battlefield victories, diplomatic coups left no visible scars. A king could wake up to find his supply lines cut, his reinforcements delayed, or his allies suddenly neutral, all without a single sword being drawn. When King James IV of Scotland sought to reclaim lost territories from England, he didn't march south immediately. First, he exploited England's tensions with France, securing a treaty that forced the English to divide their forces. By the time England realized what had happened, James was already crossing the border with uncontested momentum, yet the risk of overplaying this game was real. Pushed too hard, and exiled kings could unite their enemies against them. That's why the shrewdest rulers paired isolation with deception, often posing as peacemakers to mask their maneuvers. Sigismund of Luxembourg, exiled from Hungary, publicly pleaded for reconciliation while privately bribing the Ottoman Sultan to raid his rival's borders. The chaos forced his opponent to divert troops, creating the perfect opening for Sigismund's return. This was the cold calculus of exile. Sometimes the surest way home was to ensure your enemy had nowhere left to turn. And for kings who mastered it, diplomacy became the sharpest blade in their sheath, one that left no blood but severed kingdoms all the same. But what happened when even isolation wasn't enough? When a rival's grip on power seemed unshakable, the most desperate exiled kings turned to a final, audacious tactic, returning not as conquerors but as liberators. They reframed their comeback not as a power grab, but as a restoration of order, justice, or even divine will. It was propaganda wrapped in pageantry, and when executed perfectly, it could turn resistance into welcome. Henry VII of England pulled this off brilliantly. Instead of presenting himself as yet another claimant in the Wars of the Roses, he arrived under banners of unity, pledging to end decades of civil strife. Towns weary of fighting opened their gates, and soldiers defected mid-campaign, convinced his reign would bring peace. The same playbook worked for Alfonso VI of Leon, who entered his kingdom not with an army, but with a promise to repeal unjust laws. By the time his rival realized the threat, the people had already switched loyalties. The lesson was clear: in the Game of Thrones, perception could be stronger than steel. An exile who returned as a conqueror risked rebellion, but one who returned as a savior, he might just find his throne waiting for him. And in that delicate shift of narrative, the most cunning kings found their greatest weapon: the power to make their return feel inevitable. Nothing disarmed suspicion faster than a king who appeared to surrender gracefully. The 10th strategy, feigning peaceful intentions, was a masterclass in strategic deception. When outright resistance was impossible, the shrewdest exiled rulers played the long con, signing humiliating treaties, swearing hollow oaths, and even publicly renouncing their claims, all while quietly sharpening their knives behind closed doors. King John of England perfected this art during his clashes with rebellious barons. After being forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, he knelt before the Pope, tearfully pledging obedience. But within months, he'd secured an annulment from Rome and was rallying mercenaries to crush his enemies. The lesson: in exile, survival often meant wearing two faces, one for show, one for war. The Byzantine Emperor Michael III took it further. After a coup forced him to retire to a monastery, he spent years playing the repentant monk, copying scriptures and praising his usurper's wisdom. Meanwhile, his agents smuggled gold to disgruntled generals and stirred unrest in the provinces. By the time Michael emerged from his act, half the army was already loyal to him. His rival never saw the betrayal coming because Michael had weaponized his own humiliation, turning submissiveness into subterfuge. Yet this strategy demanded more than just lying. It required an acute understanding of human nature. Rulers like Sweden's Gustav Vasa, who pretended to accept Danish rule while secretly organizing peasant revolts, knew that people believe what they want to see. A defeated king who groveled convincingly enough could make his enemies lower their guard, mistaking performance for surrender. And that's when the real work began: rebuilding networks, stockpiling arms, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Symbolism, though, would become their final weapon, because once the stage was set, exiled kings needed more than stealth, they needed spectacle. A banner raised at the right moment, a relic brandished before battle, or a prophecy carefully circulated could turn cautious supporters into fervent believers. And in that alchemy of image and timing, the most improbable comebacks were born. A discarded crown in the dirt wasn't just lost metal, it was a surrendered kingdom. That's why the smartest exiled kings clung to symbols like lifelines, turning every gesture into a declaration of unfinished business. Richard II knew this well. Even as he rotted in Pontefract Castle, his loyalists circulated handwritten decrees stamped with his seal, proving he still ruled in spirit if not in fact. Coins minted in his name slipped into marketplaces, whispering to peasants that his return was inevitable. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were psychological warfare, eroding his captors' legitimacy with every whispered rumor and hidden keepsake. But symbols required more than just nostalgia, they demanded audacity. When the Scottish King David II fled to France during English occupation, he didn't hide in shame. He held full court in exile, wearing his regalia and receiving ambassadors as if Edinburgh still answered to him. The message was clear: distance didn't diminish his sovereignty. Meanwhile, Byzantine emperors like Andronikos IV took it further, commissioning portraits that showed them enthroned beside saints, their exile framed as a holy intermission rather than defeat. The brilliance of these gestures lay in their simplicity. A crown could be stolen, but the idea of a king, that was harder to kill. In Hungary, Matthias Corvinus's supporters kept his coronation cloak hidden for years, passing it between noble houses like a sacred relic. Each secret viewing reinforced their oath. He was still their true ruler, no matter who sat on the throne. And when symbols weren't enough, some kings turned to guerrilla warfare, the ultimate fusion of theater and tactics. Robert the Bruce didn't just hide in the Scottish Highlands, he turned them into a stage. His hit-and-run raids weren't just military strikes, they were performances designed to shatter English morale. Ambushing supply trains under cover of fog, leaving cryptic warnings carved into trees, even disguising his men as merchants to infiltrate enemy camps. Every act blurred the line between rebellion and legend. The English couldn't crush what they couldn't find, and with each disappearing act, Bruce's myth grew. Guerrilla warfare played to an exile's greatest strengths: unpredictability and local knowledge. When Skanderbeg fought to reclaim Albania from the Ottomans, he didn't meet their armies head-on. He lured them into mountain passes where avalanches could be triggered, poisoned wells along their routes, and used coded smoke signals to coordinate attacks. To the Ottomans, it seemed like the land itself was rejecting them, a psychological victory as potent as any battlefield triumph. Yet this strategy came with brutal costs. Guerrilla kings often relied on peasants for food and shelter, drawing reprisals that devastated villages. The Castilian rebel Henry of Trastamara won his throne through ambushes and sabotage, but only after his tactics turned entire regions into wastelands. Still, for rulers with no other options, it was a price worth paying. Because in the end, rebellion wasn't just about winning battles, it was about making the usurper's grip feel fragile. One raid, one rumor, one symbol at a time. And when even stealth and symbolism weren't enough, the most desperate exiles turned to their final, most dangerous gambit: the art of disappearing completely, not to surrender, but to rewrite their stories from the shadows. When traditional warfare was impossible, exiled kings turned to the shadows not with grand armies, but with stealth, cunning, and the element of surprise. Guerrilla tactics became the great equalizer for rulers stripped of their thrones, allowing them to wage war without ever facing their enemies head-on. Take Owain Glyndwr, the Welsh prince who vanished into the mountains after his rebellion failed. While the English hunted him, he orchestrated a campaign of chaos, burning supply depots, ambushing patrols, and disappearing into the mist before retaliation could come. His goal wasn't just to inflict damage, it was to make the English occupation feel like a waking nightmare where no road was safe and no garrison could rest. But Glyndwr wasn't alone in this shadow war. In the Balkans, the Serbian king Lazar II used similar tactics against the Ottomans, striking at night and melting into the forests by dawn. His fighters, dressed as peasants, would blend into villages until the moment came to sabotage bridges or poison wells. The psychological toll was devastating. An empire could crush a rebellion, but how do you defeat an enemy who refuses to stand and fight? The genius of guerrilla warfare lay in its economy of force. A handful of determined fighters could tie down thousands of enemy troops, forcing them to spread thin across hostile terrain. Every ambush eroded morale, every raid made the usurper's grip feel tenuous. And for the exiled king, these small victories were propaganda gold. Rumors of his invisible army grew with each attack, drawing fresh supporters to his cause. Yet the risks were brutal. Guerrilla kings lived like fugitives, often relying on peasants for food and shelter, putting entire villages in the crosshairs of reprisals. Glyndwr's family was captured and imprisoned, his homes were burned, but for rulers with no other options, the trade-off was clear: better a war of shadows than no war at all. And when stealth alone wasn't enough to sway hearts and minds, exiled kings turned to another potent weapon: words, because while swords could win battles, it was manifestos that won wars. Words on parchment could topple thrones just as surely as siege engines. When exiled kings couldn't wield swords, they wielded quills, crafting manifestos that transformed their banishment into moral crusades. Charles I of England turned his prison cell into a propaganda machine, penning letters that framed his executioners as traitors and himself as a suffering saint. These documents weren't just personal diaries, they were strategic missiles smuggled out to loyalists who copied and spread them like wildfire. A single manifesto could do what an army couldn't: turn public opinion against a usurper without shedding a drop of blood. But Charles wasn't alone in this battle of ink. The deposed Swedish Queen Christina, after abdicating and fleeing to Rome, flooded Europe with treatises defending her right to rule, painting her exile as a voluntary pilgrimage rather than defeat. Her words reached further than any courier, swaying Catholic powers to her cause. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II used legal arguments instead of pleas, drafting intricate decrees that declared his rival's election invalid. By weaponizing the law itself, he turned scholars and clerics into his unwitting allies. The true power of these documents lay in their duality. They were both shield and sword. A well-crafted proclamation could legitimize a king's claim while demonizing his enemies, all under the guise of sober argument. When Henry VII prepared to invade England, his camp circulated articles of grievances listing Richard III's alleged crimes. It didn't matter if every accusation was true. The sheer volume of charges made resistance seem like complicity. Yet manifestos required more than grand rhetoric. They demanded intimate knowledge of their audience. A letter appealing to French nobles might emphasize chivalric honor, while one aimed at merchants detailed tax reforms. The exiled Byzantine Emperor John VI mastered this, tailoring his messages to different factions. To peasants, he promised lighter levies; to soldiers, back pay; to bishops, restored church privileges. Each version reinforced the same core idea: his return meant stability. but through lenses that resonated uniquely. This brings us to the quietest weapon in an exile's arsenal: observation. Kings who studied their enemies from afar didn't just gather intelligence, they uncovered fatal flaws invisible from the throne. While imprisoned in Windsor Castle, James I of Scotland spent years decoding English court politics through whispered conversations and smuggled letters. By the time he was ransomed, he knew which nobles resented the regency's taxes, which generals felt slighted, knowledge he later used to negotiate Scotland's independence. The French King Louis XI took espionage further. His Exile as Dauphin was really an 8-year masterclass in reconnaissance. He embedded agents in every major European court, compiling dossiers on rivals' habits, weaknesses, and unpaid debts. When he finally seized power, he didn't need to bribe or threaten most opponents. He simply reminded them of the secrets he'd gathered. Information, he proved, was the ultimate currency. What separated the triumphant exiles from the forgotten wasn't just resilience, it was their ability to turn isolation into education. Every moment away from power became a chance to scrutinize their enemies' blind spots, to study the cracks in their armor. Because when the time came to strike, knowledge would prove sharper than any blade. Exile wasn't just banishment, it was a front-row seat to an enemy's unraveling. Stripped of power, deposed kings gained something far more valuable than armies: the chance to study their rivals without the blinders of courtly flattery or the distractions of rule. From the shadows, they watched factions fracture, alliances crumble, and overconfidence breed fatal mistakes. Alfonso VI of Leon didn't waste his years exiled in Toledo. He catalogued every grievance among Castile's nobles, every tax resentment festering in its towns. When he finally returned, he didn't attack blindly. He pressed where the cracks were deepest, turning minor squabbles into revolts that shattered his rivals' reign from within. This wasn't passive observation, it was reconnaissance refined to an art. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, exiled as a young man, spent his wanderings mapping the empire's military weaknesses. He noted which border forts were undermanned, which supply routes were vulnerable, even which generals resented their posts. Years later, when he led his rebellion, those details became his playbook. His troops didn't just win battles, they exploited every logistical flaw his rivals never noticed. The shrewdest exiled rulers understood that time was their ally. While usurpers grew complacent on stolen thrones, these kings became students of decay. They tracked how new taxes eroded loyalty, how favoritism bred resentment, how garrisons grew lax without real threats. When Henry VII plotted his return to England, his spies didn't just count soldiers, they recorded which noble households stopped displaying Richard III's crest, which ports grumbled about customs duties. By the time he crossed the Channel, Henry knew exactly which towns would open their gates without a fight. Yet knowledge alone wasn't enough, timing was everything. The French King Louis XI, exiled during his father's reign, waited like a spider while his enemies overextended. He let them bankrupt themselves with wars, alienate allies with arrogance, until the moment their strength was illusory. Then he struck not at their armies, but at their exhausted treasury and disillusioned supporters. His victory wasn't just military, it was mathematical, the inevitable result of letting rivals dig their own graves. The true masters of this strategy turned exile into a laboratory. They didn't just observe, they experimented, testing loyalties with carefully leaked rumors or probing defenses with staged raids. When Robert the Bruce hid in the Scottish Highlands, he didn't just plan battles, he studied English supply routes, learning which convoys traveled lightly guarded, which officers could be bribed. His greatest weapon wasn't his sword, it was the ledger in his pocket tracking every vulnerability he'd exploit later. And when the moment came, these kings didn't just return, they staged spectacles designed to magnify their enemies' failures. A well-timed entrance during a harvest famine, a dramatic appearance after a costly military blunder, these weren't accidents. They were psychological coups, turning Exile's end into a theatrical unmasking of their rivals' incompetence. Because in the end, the throne didn't just belong to the strongest claimant. It went to the one who understood his enemy better than they understood themselves. Now picture the scene. A deposed king, once a whisper in the shadows, steps into the light not as a beggar, but as the solution to every crisis his rival ignored. That's when exile stopped being a sentence and became the ultimate advantage. A king's return wasn't just about reclaiming a throne, it was about staging a moment so unforgettable, it erased years of exile in a single stroke. Timing wasn't left to chance, it was choreographed like a theatrical premiere. Henry V understood this perfectly. When he sailed back to England after his victory at Agincourt, he didn't slip quietly into London under cover of night. He orchestrated a procession fit for a conqueror, riding through streets lined with cheering crowds, his armor gleaming, his enemies' banners trailing in the dirt behind him. The date wasn't random either. His return coincided with the feast of St. George, England's patron saint, wrapping his triumph in a cloak of divine favor. This wasn't just a homecoming, it was a propaganda masterpiece designed to cement his legend in real time. But Henry wasn't alone in turning reappearances into political theater. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian II staged his return to Constantinople after a decade in exile by arriving unannounced at the city's harbor with a small band of loyalists. The shock of his sudden presence, combined with rumors he'd survived having his nose slit, sent ripples through the capital. Within hours, the usurper's support crumbled, not because of an army, but because Justinian had turned his own mutilation into a symbol of resilience. The spectacle of his scarred face, far from repelling supporters, became proof of his unbroken claim. The psychology behind these dramatic entrances was razor-sharp. A king who crept back into his kingdom risked looking like a fugitive, but one who arrived with fanfare forced his subjects to choose sides publicly. Doubters couldn't hedge their bets when the streets erupted in celebration. This was particularly crucial during succession crises, those fragile moments when a throne hung in the balance and loyalty was up for grabs. Exiled rulers didn't just wait for these crises, they engineered their returns to exploit them. Take the chaos that followed the death of England's Richard the Lionheart. His brother John, unpopular and scrambling for legitimacy, faced rebellions on multiple fronts. Enter Arthur of Brittany, Richard's teenage nephew and a rival claimant who'd been raised in exile at the French court. Sensing John's weakness, Arthur didn't just cross the channel. He timed his landing to coincide with Easter, when nobles gathered for feasts and whispers traveled fastest. His arrival wasn't just a military move, it was a symbolic challenge framed as a restoration of Richard's true lineage. For a moment, it worked until John's brutality turned the tide. But the lesson lingered. In the vacuum of a succession crisis, spectacle could outweigh strength. The savviest exiled kings didn't just exploit these crises, they manufactured them. When Alfonso VI of Leon wanted to reclaim his throne from his brother, he didn't march immediately. He waited until a Moorish invasion stretched his brother's forces thin, then struck, positioning himself not as a usurper, but as the only leader capable of uniting the kingdom against foreign threats. His reappearance wasn't just well-timed, it was narratively flawless, transforming a power grab into a patriotic rescue mission, and that's where the true artistry lay. These rulers didn't just reclaim thrones, they rewrote the stories of their exile, turning years of absence into a necessary prelude to their triumphant return. Every hardship became a test of worthiness, every rival's misstep proof of divine judgment. By the time they stepped back into the light, their comeback didn't just feel strategic, it felt inevitable. But succession crises weren't the only vulnerabilities exiled kings exploited. The most cunning among them targeted an even deeper fault line: the simmering grudges and ambitions of their rivals' own families. Because nothing fractured a usurper's court faster than the secrets hiding behind its gilded doors, a disputed succession wasn't just political chaos, it was an exiled king's golden ticket back to power. When a throne hung in the balance, with multiple claimants tearing the realm apart, that's when the shrewdest deposed rulers made their move. They didn't present themselves as just another contender. They positioned themselves as the only solution to the madness. Take Stephen of England, who watched from exile as his cousin Matilda and her supporters plunged the kingdom into civil war, a period so brutal it became known as the Anarchy. While others fought, Stephen waited, and when the nobles grew exhausted by years of bloodshed, he emerged not as a conqueror, but as a compromise candidate, the one man who could end the suffering. His genius wasn't in winning battles, it was in letting his enemies discredit themselves first. But succession crises offered more than just timing advantages. They exposed the fragile seams holding kingdoms together: nobles with grudges, regions feeling neglected, factions nursing old wounds. Exiled kings became experts at stitching these fractures into alliances. In 14th century Castile, Henry of Trastamara didn't just exploit his half-brother Peter the Cruel's unpopularity. He weaponized every disaffected noble, every merchant angry over taxes, every clergyman alienated by Peter's ruthlessness. By the time Henry marched home, he wasn't leading an invasion. He was fronting a coalition of the disillusioned. The real art lay in reading the chaos like a map. Some succession crises were obvious, like the War of the Roses' bloody tug of war. Others simmered quietly, visible only to those patient enough to look. The Byzantine Emperor Basil I, a former peasant turned exile, spotted his chance when the child Emperor Michael III's regents began feuding. Basil didn't charge into the palace. He befriended the isolated young ruler, positioning himself as the sole trustworthy figure in a nest of vipers. Within months, he wasn't just back in power, he was the power behind the throne, and soon the throne itself. Yet exploiting these moments required more than opportunism. It demanded an exile's intimate knowledge of the court's hidden tensions, the kind gained only through networks of informants. Because no king could exploit a crisis if he didn't see it coming, and that's where the 17th strategy came into play: the invisible web of spies, sympathizers, and sleeper agents who turned exile into an intelligence-gathering superpower. A deposed king without eyes and ears was a king already dead. The 17th strategy, building secret networks, turned exile from a prison into a command center where every whisper could be weaponized. Take Mary, Queen of Scots, who waged her fight for the English throne not on battlefields, but in the margins of innocuous-seeming letters. Her cipher, a labyrinth of symbols and substitutions, turned routine correspondence into a lifeline. A mention of the Black Mare might signal a shipment of weapons. A query about gardening tools could mean loyalists were ready to strike. But Mary's genius wasn't just in codes, it was in her couriers. Dressmakers carried folded notes in their seams, priests hid dispatches inside prayer books, and even her laundress became a smuggler, stitching messages into the hems of petticoats. Yet Mary's network was just one variation on an ancient art. Byzantine emperors exiled to distant islands didn't languish, they built shadow governments. Alexios Komnenos, while banished to a monastery, trained monks as spies. These holy messengers traveled freely between provinces, their robes hiding troop movements scribbled on parchment thin as onion skin. Meanwhile, Henry VII of England turned merchant ships into his intelligence web. Captains sympathetic to his cause reported which ports were lightly guarded, which towns muttered against Richard III, even which taverns hosted disgruntled soldiers ripe for recruitment. Secrecy wasn't just about hiding, it was about seeing. The Swedish king Gustav Vasa, hiding in peasant garb after a failed revolt, didn't just avoid capture. He listened. Village blacksmiths told him which noble's armor was being repaired, a sign they were preparing for war. Innkeepers revealed which tax collectors were most hated, and therefore which regions might rebel. By the time Gustav emerged, he didn't just have an army, he had a map of his enemy's weakest points, drawn in the ink of everyday gossip. The risk, of course, was betrayal. One loose tongue could unravel years of careful plotting. That's why the smartest exiled kings compartmentalized their networks like medieval spy chiefs. In 15th century Castile, Enrique IV's supporters used a chain of blind messengers. No single courier knew both the message's origin and destination. The French Dauphin Louis XI went further, planting false rumors among his own informants to smoke out traitors. If a lie he'd fed to one spy resurfaced in his enemy's court, he knew exactly whose loyalty had cracked. But the most powerful networks weren't built on fear, they thrived on shared purpose. When Robert the Bruce vanished after defeat, his sister Christina became the silent architect of his resurgence. She hosted clandestine meetings in her spinning room where the rhythmic clatter of looms masked plotting, clan chiefs arriving as wool buyers left with battle plans tucked into their belts. This wasn't just espionage, it was community, a web of trust spun tighter with every passing month of exile. And that's where exile's greatest irony emerged. By being erased from public view, these kings often became more connected than ever. Stripped of palaces and pageantry, they learned to listen not to sycophants, but to blacksmiths, sailors, and shepherds. Their networks became living tapestries, woven from threads the throne had never noticed. Because in the end, a kingdom wasn't just castles and crowns, it was people, and the ruler who remembered that in exile would rarely stay exiled for long. Now consider the ultimate transformation, when kings didn't just survive banishment, but used it to rewrite their very identities. Because sometimes losing a throne was the best way to discover what kind of ruler you were truly meant to be. Exile didn't just strip kings of their thrones, it stripped them of their old identities, forcing reinvention or oblivion. For rulers like Henry VII, years abroad weren't merely spent plotting. They were an opportunity to shed a tarnished past and craft a new narrative. Gone was the exiled fugitive hunted by Richard III's agents. In his place stood a statesman, a unifier, a king who'd absorbed the political sophistication of the French court and returned not with vengeance but with a vision. His transformation wasn't accidental. Every speech, every proclamation, even the strategic choice to marry Elizabeth of York, symbolically joining the Warring Roses, was calculated to erase memories of civil war and position him as the architect of a fresh era. This wasn't just rebranding, it was political alchemy, turning the lead of exile into the gold of legitimacy. But Henry wasn't alone in his metamorphosis. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV, after a humiliating defeat and mutilation by the Seljuks, didn't just vanish into obscurity. Though blinded and exiled, he used his remaining influence to pen letters framing himself as a martyr for Christendom. His physical scars, once marks of shame, became emblems of sacrifice. Similarly, Sweden's Gustav Vasa, who'd begun his rebellion as little more than a disgruntled noble, spent his exile crafting an image as the people's champion. By the time he returned, his rhetoric had shifted from personal grievance to national liberation, a subtle but seismic reframing that turned regional unrest into a full-blown revolution. The most cunning exiles didn't just change their messaging, they transformed their very personas. The French dauphin Louis XI, known in his youth as arrogant and impulsive, used his years of exile to cultivate a reputation for patience and wisdom. He swapped velvet for simple wool, hosted scholars instead of sycophants, and let rumors of his newfound humility spread ahead of him. When he finally reclaimed his throne, the contrast with his reckless past was so stark that even former enemies gave him the benefit of the doubt. Yet reinvention carried risks. A king who softened his image too much risked appearing weak. When the Scottish King James III tried to shed his reputation for favoritism by distancing himself from unpopular advisors, his sudden about-face only made him seem indecisive. Likewise, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV's public penance at Canossa, standing barefoot in the snow to beg the Pope's forgiveness, saved his crown but eroded his aura of invincibility. The lesson: image-making was a tightrope walk. Too little change and the stains of the past remained. Too much and the crown's mystique crumbled. The savviest exiles understood that perception was layered. It wasn't enough to alter how nobles saw them. They needed to rewrite their stories for peasants, clergy, and foreign courts too. Alfonso VI of Leon, after years exiled in Toledo, returned fluent in Arabic and dressed in Moorish silks, a deliberate signal to his diverse subjects that he was a bridge between cultures, not just a Christian warlord. Meanwhile, the deposed Norwegian king Olaf II, once seen as a brute, used his exile to embrace piety, commissioning sagas that recast his youth's violence as the fiery temper of a saint in waiting. By the time he died in battle, his transformation was so complete that he was canonized within a year. This wasn't mere spin. In an era when kingship was entwined with divine right and personal loyalty, image was infrastructure. A ruler who could convincingly portray exile as purification, his suffering a trial by which he'd been made worthy, didn't just regain power, he reforged it into something more resilient. Because in the end, the throne wasn't just a seat of authority, it was a story, and the exiled kings who rewrote theirs didn't just come home, they returned as something new. Now consider the courtroom as the next battlefield, because while image shaped hearts, laws shaped thrones, and exiled rulers became adept at bending both to their will. A crown could be stolen, but the law, that was harder to erase, and exiled kings became masters at bending it to their will. Legal manipulation wasn't just about dusty scrolls and courtroom debates. It was psychological warfare waged with ink and seals. When Edward IV returned to England to overthrow Henry VI, he didn't just bring an army, he brought lawyers. His supporters unearthed ancient precedents, twisted inheritance laws, and even circulated, rediscovered royal decrees proving his claim was divinely ordained. The goal wasn't to win a trial, it was to frame his invasion as a righteous restoration, turning battlefields into courtrooms where the verdict was decided by swords. But Edward wasn't alone in weaponizing the law. The Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII, exiled after the Fourth Crusade, commissioned scholars to scour archives for loopholes that painted the Latin rulers as illegitimate occupiers. His trump card, a meticulously forged document, proving the Crusaders had violated sacred oaths, making their rule null and void. Meanwhile, in Spain, Alfonso X of Castile, known as the Learned, used his exile to compile legal codes so exhaustive that they became the bedrock of his restored reign. By the time he returned, his enemies weren't just facing a king, they were facing the living embodiment of justice itself. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its universality. A peasant might not understand dynastic claims, but they grasped stolen inheritances. A merchant might ignore battlefield glory, but they respected contracts. When kings like Francis Charles VII cited Salic law to disinherit rivals, or when Scotland's Robert the Bruce had clerics declare his excommunication invalid, they weren't just arguing, they were reframing reality. Every parchment, every seal, every whispered, ancient rite chipped away at their enemy's legitimacy, turning rebellion into restitution. Yet the boldest exiles didn't stop at manipulating laws, they rewrote them. And when even that failed, they turned to a far older code: take what you need, because for kings with empty coffers and desperate ambitions, the sea offered opportunities no courtroom ever could. Piracy wasn't just a crime, it was a royal revenue stream. When exiled kings ran out of allies and loans, they turned to the high seas, where a well-placed privateer could fill their coffers faster than any tax. The Welsh prince Owain Glyndwr, cut off from traditional funding during his rebellion, didn't just hide in the mountains. He unleashed a fleet of corsairs on English shipping lanes. His navy of repurposed fishing boats became the terror of the Irish Sea, capturing cargoes of wool, wine, and weapons that kept his rebellion alive. To the English, they were pirates. To Owain, they were the maritime wing of his liberation army. But Glyndwr wasn't the only monarch turned trader. The exiled Norwegian king Eirik the priest-hater funded his comeback by licensing privateers to prey on Hanseatic merchant ships, skimming a cut of every captured vessel. Even the Knights Hospitaller, after losing Rhodes to the Ottomans, turned to sanctioned piracy, their galleys becoming the Mediterranean's most feared tax collectors. The line between king and corsair blurred when thrones were at stake. The real genius lay in the paperwork. Savvy exiles like England's Henry VII issued letters of marque, legally sanctioning their pirates as legitimate privateers. A captured captain waving a royal commission couldn't be hanged as a common criminal. He was a soldier following orders. This legal sleight of hand transformed plunder into policy, filling war chests while maintaining deniability. After all, if a Spanish ship mysteriously vanished, was it really the exiled Portuguese king's fault? Or just unfortunate weather? Yet piracy carried brutal risks. Relying on cutthroats meant trusting men who'd as soon slit your throat as salute you. When the Scottish king David II tried funding his return with captured English merchant goods, his own privateers turned on him, selling the loot for themselves instead of his cause. And then there was the backlash. Nothing unified enemies faster than shared outrage over stolen cargo. But for kings with nothing left to lose, the sea offered one final advantage: mobility. A pirate fleet could strike anywhere, vanish into fog, or regroup on hidden shores, making exile not just a setback, but a strategic repositioning. Because sometimes the best way to reclaim a kingdom wasn't from within its borders, but from the decks of ships that made the ocean itself your castle. When gold ran dry and allies turned scarce, exiled kings turned to the one industry that never asked for royal pedigrees: piracy. The sea became their treasury, and every enemy vessel a floating bank waiting to be plundered. Take Edward the Black Prince, the legendary English commander during the 100 Years' War. Officially, he was a chivalric hero. Unofficially, he bankrolled entire campaigns by unleashing licensed pirates on French merchant convoys. His privateers operated under letters of marque, legal loopholes that transformed cutthroats into crown-sanctioned raiders. The spoils, divided like shares in a brutal corporation, a third to the crew, a third to the ship's owner, and a third straight into Edward's war chest. But the Black Prince wasn't innovating, he was perfecting an ancient hustle. Centuries earlier, the Viking king Olaf Tryggvason funded his return to Norway by raiding English coasts, then reinvesting the loot into bribes for Norse chieftains. Even the Knights Hospitaller, after being expelled from Rhodes, turned their galleys into pirate fleets, targeting Ottoman ships under the thin veneer of holy war. The line between noble and nautical thief blurred when survival was at stake. The real genius of royal piracy lay in its deniability. A king could publicly condemn sea raids while quietly taking a cut. When the deposed Cypriot king James II needed funds, his agents recruited Catalan pirates with promises of pardons and a slice of the loot. If caught, these raiders faced execution while James feigned ignorance. Yet the risk of betrayal ran high. Pirates were loyal only to profit, and more than one exiled ruler found themselves double-crossed by their own hired corsairs. Hostages, though, became the next currency in this desperate economy, because while gold could buy mercenaries, human collateral could buy loyalty, or at least silence. The exiled Byzantine Emperor Andronikos IV once seized the children of key nobles during his escape, holding them as insurance against pursuit. These weren't just prisoners, they were leverage, living guarantees that powerful families would think twice before opposing his return. The calculus was cold but effective. A noble might risk their own life to stop a deposed king's comeback, but would they sacrifice their heir? The French Dauphin Charles, during his feud with Burgundy, took this strategy further. He invited the sons of rebellious lords to his court as honored guests. Wined, dined, and subtly guarded, these boys became human shields against their father's ambitions. Meanwhile, in Scotland, Robert the Bruce's sister famously hosted the children of rival clans under her roof, weaving a web of implied threats dressed as hospitality. Yet hostages could backfire spectacularly. When the exiled Castilian King Alfonso VI took the son of a Moorish ally as collateral, the boy's accidental death turned a tentative alliance into a blood feud. The lesson: fear might secure short-term obedience, but it planted seeds of future rebellion. The smartest exiled rulers used hostages sparingly, not as cudgels, but as chess pieces, released at just the right moment to inspire gratitude rather than resentment. And so the game continued, shifting from the chaos of the high seas to the quiet terror of gilded cages. Because in the end, thrones weren't just won with swords or gold, but with the unspoken language of power, where a child's safety could be as decisive as any army. A hostage wasn't just a prisoner, it was a living contract, a guarantee etched in flesh and fear. When Richard the Lionheart was captured returning from the Crusades, his enemies didn't just demand gold for his freedom, they demanded hostages, English nobles handed over as collateral to ensure the ransom kept flowing. But Richard, ever the strategist, flipped the script. Once freed, he took hostages of his own, seizing the sons of French barons to deter attacks on his weakened realm. Their value wasn't in dungeons or chains, it was in the unspoken threat that hung over every hostile move. A single order and generations of a noble house could vanish. Yet hostages weren't always about brute intimidation. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II turned them into instruments of long-term control. After crushing a Bulgarian rebellion, he took 30,000 prisoners, not to execute but to conscript. These boys were raised as elite imperial guards, their loyalty forged through privilege rather than fear. Decades later, they'd become the backbone of his army, their former identities erased by the very empire that had conquered them. This was hostage-taking as cultural alchemy, transforming enemies into devotees. But the most cunning rulers understood that hostages worked best when they weren't treated as prisoners at all. When the Scottish King David II was held captive by the English, he was paraded not in chains but as an honored guest, dining at court, hunting with nobles, even advising on Scottish affairs. The message to his subjects was clear: resistance was pointless when their king seemed content. Yet behind the charade, David was subtly negotiating, using his access to plant dissent among England's own factions. His captivity became a Trojan horse, turning the enemy's court into his own chessboard. Now, imagine a king pushing this game of shadows to its ultimate extreme, not just taking hostages, but faking his own death. Because sometimes the surest way to reclaim a throne was to make the world believe you'd never return at all. Staging a disappearance wasn't just about hiding, it was about rewriting reality. When the Byzantine general Belisarius fell from favor, rumors swirled that he'd been blinded and left to beg in the streets. But whispers persisted that the beggar was an imposter, and the real Belisarius lived, waiting to strike. The doubt alone paralyzed his enemies, forcing them to divert resources hunting a ghost. Meanwhile, in medieval Japan, the exiled emperor Go-Daigo spread tales of his death so convincingly that his rival's court celebrated only for him to emerge months later with fresh allies, his resurrection sparking a wave of defections. The genius of these deceptions lay in their psychological toll. A dead king could be mourned and forgotten. A missing one became an obsession. Every unexplained shadow, every anonymous rebel leader, every rumor from a distant monastery kept opponents off balance. The French pretender Charles the Bold exploited this after his defeat at Nancy by letting Swiss mercenaries circulate stories of his corpse being eaten by wolves. By the time he resurfaced, his enemies had already fractured, each faction blaming the others for failing to confirm the kill. Yet faking death wasn't without risks. Return too soon and the ruse collapsed. Wait too long and the throne might slip away forever. The key was timing the reveal like a theatrical crescendo, precisely when doubt had eroded the usurper's grip. When the Serbian Prince Lazar staged his return during a solar eclipse, his followers didn't just cheer, they saw divine intervention. His rebirth wasn't just political, it was cosmic. And that's where Exile's final lesson emerged. Sometimes the most powerful kings weren't those who ruled from palaces, but those who mastered the art of vanishing, only to reappear when the world least expected it. Because in the end, the throne didn't always go to the strongest or the richest. It went to the one who understood that perception was the ultimate weapon, and that to control a kingdom, you first had to control what it believed. A king's sudden disappearance could be more devastating than any battlefield defeat for his enemies. When rulers like King Sebastian of Portugal vanished without a trace, they didn't just leave a power vacuum, they spawned legends. Sebastian's disastrous crusade in Morocco ended with his army annihilated and his fate unknown. But instead of closure, his absence became a weapon. Loyalists whispered he'd return in Portugal's darkest hour, a messianic figure riding out of the mist. For decades, impostors capitalized on this myth, each claiming to be the lost king, stirring unrest that kept Sebastian's rivals perpetually off balance. The brilliance of this deception: a dead king could be replaced, but a missing one kept hope and fear alive indefinitely. Other monarchs took a more active role in their own deaths. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, after being overthrown and mutilated, let rumors of his demise spread while he healed in exile. By the time he marched back to Constantinople, his enemies had grown complacent, their defenses relaxed under the illusion of safety. The shock of his return shattered their morale before the first sword was drawn. Meanwhile, in Japan, the exiled emperor Go-Daigo staged his own death so convincingly that his rival's court celebrated, only for him to emerge months later with fresh allies, his resurrection sparking a wave of defections. These rulers understood a fundamental truth: nothing unnerved an opponent like a ghost who refused to stay buried. But faking death wasn't just about surprise, it was about timing. The Serbian Prince Lazar waited until a solar eclipse darkened the sky to reveal his survival, framing his return as divinely ordained. The eclipse wasn't just spectacle, it was psychological warfare, turning superstition into an ally. Similarly, the French pretender Charles the Bold let Swiss mercenaries spread gruesome tales of his corpse being devoured by wolves. While his enemies bickered over the spoils of his demise, he regrouped in secret, returning just as their temporary alliances began to fracture. The risk, of course, was losing control of the narrative. When King Louis XVII of France died in prison, royalists clung to escape theories for years, wasting resources chasing shadows. Yet for those who mastered the art, death became the ultimate disguise, a way to reset the board while their enemies grew careless. And when the moment came, their reappearance wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a theatrical strike at the psyche of those who'd written them off. Now, imagine leveraging chaos of a different kind, not manufactured but natural. Because when earthquakes shattered cities or plagues emptied streets, exiled kings saw not tragedy but opportunity. A ruler's greatest weapon might not be an army but a well-timed disaster. When famine withered crops or plague emptied cities, exiled kings saw not just suffering, they saw strategy. Natural disasters weren't tragedies to mourn, they were vulnerabilities to exploit, cracks in a rival's reign waiting to be pried open. Alfonso X of Castile understood this cold calculus. When drought parched his kingdom and grain stores dwindled, his usurper's incompetence became impossible to ignore. Alfonso didn't just send aid from exile, he arrived with it, his wagons laden with Sicilian wheat bought with borrowed gold. Starving peasants didn't see a deposed king, they saw a savior breaking bread where their ruler had failed. Within months, the very misery meant to weaken his claim became the engine of his return. But Alfonso wasn't alone in turning catastrophe into coronation. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, exiled during the Nika riots, watched as Constantinople burned, then seized the chaos to purge his enemies. By framing the disaster as divine punishment for his rival's corruption, he didn't just reclaim his throne, he reshaped the narrative itself. Even earthquakes could be weaponized. When tremors shattered the walls of Antioch in 526, the exiled patriarch Ephraim didn't rebuild churches, he rebuilt loyalty, personally overseeing reconstruction while his rival hid in luxury. The lesson was clear: in times of crisis, visibility was power. A king who handed out alms in the rubble didn't just feed the hungry, he fed his own legend. Yet leveraging disasters required more than opportunism, it demanded preparation. Smart rulers stockpiled not just grain but grievances, waiting for the moment when a failed harvest or an outbreak would make their promises sound sweeter. The French Dauphin Charles, exiled during the Black Death, didn't just survive the pandemic, he studied it. While his rivals huddled in isolated castles, his agents documented which villages were abandoned, which nobles hoarded medicine, which bishops fled their flocks. When he returned, his speeches didn't focus on his right to rule. They focused on the dead left unburied under his predecessor's watch. The shrewdest exiles didn't just react to disasters, they anticipated them. The Norse king Harald Hardrada, exiled in Constantinople, spent years mapping the empire's grain routes and plague hospices. Later, when a volcanic winter triggered famine in Norway, he didn't just import food, he controlled its distribution, turning breadlines into loyalty oaths. Meanwhile, in Japan, the exiled emperor Go-Daigo used a tsunami's devastation to frame his rival's reign as cursed by the gods. His comeback wasn't just political, it was cosmic, with the very earth seeming to reject his enemy's rule. This was the brutal poetry of exile. A king who'd lost everything could still find his path home written in the ashes of a burning city or the silence of emptied streets. Because when the world crumbled, people didn't want a ruler who promised glory. They wanted one who'd kneel in the dirt beside them. And that's where the next strategy unfolded, not in the chaos of disaster, but in the quiet cultivation of something more enduring than any crisis: the power of art, knowledge, and cultural legacy. Because while armies won battles, it was poets and scholars who won hearts, and no one knew this better than the exiled kings who turned courts into salons and thrones into patrons of the greatest minds of their age. A brushstroke could be as powerful as a sword stroke when it came to winning back a kingdom. For exiled kings, patronizing artists wasn't just about passing the time, it was about rewriting history in real time. Take Charles the Bold of Burgundy, who transformed his court in exile into a glittering hub of painters, poets, and musicians. Their mission: to flood Europe with tapestries depicting him as the rightful heir, his rivals as sniveling usurpers, and his eventual return as destiny itself. These weren't decorations, they were propaganda weapons, smuggled into noble households where their golden threads whispered sedition louder than any rebel's speech. But Charles wasn't the first to weaponize culture. The exiled Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzenios, stripped of his throne and forced into a monastery, didn't waste his years brooding. He penned memoirs so meticulously crafted that they didn't just defend his reign, they erased his mistakes, casting his exile as a spiritual retreat rather than a defeat. Manuscript copies circulated like medieval bestsellers, slowly rehabilitating his image until his grandson could reclaim power with public opinion preemptively softened. The real genius of cultural patronage lay in its subtlety. A ballad praising an exiled king's bravery might be hummed in taverns. A fresco of his coronation could hang in a merchant's hall, normalizing his claim. Alfonso X of Castile, during his bitter exile, commissioned astronomical treatises that framed his rule as enlightened, contrasting his scholarly pursuits with his rival's crude militarism. By the time he returned, the narrative was set. He wasn't just a king, but a philosopher king. His time away spun as a period of intellectual refinement rather than failure. Yet the shrewdest rulers didn't just glorify themselves, they demonized their enemies through art. When Henry Tudor was holed up in Brittany, his supporters circulated woodcuts showing Richard III as a hunchbacked monster clutching his stolen crown. Never mind that Richard's actual posture was merely slightly uneven. The image stuck, poisoning his reputation centuries before Shakespeare immortalized the slander. Similarly, the deposed Swedish Queen Christina funded playwrights to satirize her cousin's court, turning his every misstep into a comedic set piece that made his reign look buffoonish. This was soft power at its most potent. A well-placed sonnet could do what an army couldn't: turn a usurper into a laughingstock or an exile into a martyr. And when combined with the right timing, it became unstoppable. As the Florentine diplomat Machiavelli noted, a ruler who controlled the artists controlled the story. And in the end, the story was often what determined who kept the throne. But even the most brilliant propaganda needed one final ingredient to ignite: a king whose very presence could electrify a room. Because no tapestry, no poem, no carefully crafted image could substitute for the raw, magnetic power of personal charisma. Charisma wasn't just a trait, it was a force of nature, capable of turning exiled kings into living legends long before they reclaimed their thrones. Take Charlemagne, who spent years wandering Europe after his father's death, his kingdom fractured by rivals, yet even in exile his presence commanded awe. Stories of his towering height, his booming laughter, and his uncanny ability to remember every soldier's name spread like wildfire. By the time he rallied his forces, men didn't follow him out of obligation, they fought for the privilege of standing at his side. That's the power of charisma. It didn't just fill rooms, it filled the gaps left by missing armies and empty treasuries. But Charlemagne wasn't unique in this alchemy of personality. The Scottish king Robert the Bruce, during his darkest days hiding in caves, became a master of the symbolic gesture. He didn't just lead, he performed. Whether it was sparing a spider's web to illustrate perseverance or riding into battle with his crown visibly dented from past fights, every act reinforced his image as the indomitable underdog. His enemies had castles and gold. He had something far more dangerous, a story that stuck. And in an era where loyalty was as fluid as the tides, that story became his strongest fortress. Yet charisma wasn't just about grand gestures. The French King Henry IV, exiled as a young man, honed a disarming charm that disarmed enemies as effectively as any blade. He'd jest with commoners, share meals with soldiers, and remember the names of merchants' children. These weren't empty courtesies, they were calculated acts of political theater. When he finally returned to Paris, the city that once rejected him as a Protestant outsider now cheered him as Good King Henry, the monarch who supposedly vowed every peasant should have a chicken in the pot on Sundays. His charisma didn't just win battles, it rewrote history, turning grudging acceptance into genuine adoration. The lesson here goes beyond medieval throne rooms. Charisma, at its core, is about making people want to believe in you. It's why Richard the Lionheart could spend years imprisoned and still return to fanfare, while his brother John, rich but reviled, died with his kingdom in revolt. One understood that leadership was a performance, the other thought it was an entitlement. So what does this mean for us today? These exiled kings teach us that resilience isn't just about enduring, it's about inspiring. Whether you're rebuilding a career, a business, or a reputation, the strategies that moved mountains centuries ago still hold power. Alliances forged in trust, narratives shaped with care, and above all, the ability to make others see not just what you are, but what you could be. Because in the end, the greatest comebacks aren't just about reclaiming what was lost, they're about becoming someone worth following. The stories of these exiled kings aren't just relics of a distant past, they're masterclasses in turning desperation into dominance. Think about what it took to stare down total defeat and still find a path back to power. These rulers didn't just survive exile, they weaponized it, using every setback as raw material for their comeback. The Byzantine emperor who turned his mutilation into a badge of honor, the Scottish king who vanished into the highlands only to re-emerge stronger, the French prince who spun years of wandering into a legend of wisdom. Their victories weren't accidents. They were the result of seeing opportunities where others saw only dead ends. What makes their strategies so compelling isn't just their audacity, it's their adaptability. When one door slammed shut, they didn't pound on it helplessly. They found a window, a crack in the foundation, or dug a tunnel if they had to. Henry VII didn't have an army. He turned merchants into spies and trade routes into intelligence networks. Robert the Bruce lacked the strength for open battle. He made the land itself his ally, using Scotland's rugged terrain as both shield and sword. These rulers understood that power isn't just about resources, it's about resourcefulness. And here's the kicker, their playbook still works today. Modern leaders might not duel with swords or bribe mercenaries with sacks of gold, but the core principles remain. Building alliances in unlikely places, that's networking with a medieval twist, controlling the narrative through propaganda. Today we call it branding. Even the guerrilla tactics of kings like Owain Glyndwr find echoes in modern asymmetric warfare and grassroots movements. The tools have changed, but the human dynamics of power, those are eternal. So the next time you face what feels like an impossible situation, whether it's a career setback, a creative block, or a personal challenge, ask yourself, what would an exiled king do? Would they waste energy mourning lost territory or start mapping their next move? The answer's obvious, because history shows us time and again that exile isn't the end of the story. It's just the dramatic pause before the comeback. Now it's your turn. Which of these royal resurrection strategies stuck with you? Was it the psychological warfare of Henry Tudor's propaganda machine, or the sheer audacity of Justinian II marching back with his slit nose as a battle standard? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear which tactics fire up your imagination. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's greatest power plays, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, we're just getting started. After all, as these kings proved, every ending is just a new beginning in disguise.